All right, and now we will move on to the this cool lion blast that we hear that we see later. What we need to consider is that those wishes look quite powerful, but the lion blast looks even more powerful. So we need to create space for it. We need to scale. Well, we need to tell the story of the sound. We need to make sure that the wishes sound cool, but they don't sound bigger or more powerful than the actual lion blast. Because as you can see, it fills up your whole screen. It's well, you know, it's really powerful, and we need to figure out some kind of a cadence and some sort of breathing space for the sound to make it impactful and punchy. And again, preferably without cluttering the mix that much. So there's a couple of layers. We'll start with the charge up, the when the lion head shows. And the way I approach this is after this mayhem that we see here. I wanted this part of the lion's head to be a little bit more of a breathing space before the big impact, but also to have a lot of character. And again, we're going to use quite a lot of tonal elements to it. The noisy elements are going to be quite low in the mix here, so that we can add something that's like a full frequency blast later on. So I think that this is a really good approach for creating all sorts of nice impacts. It's just like be able to create some kind of a breathing space before it. And if you know that there are actions preceding it, like those whooshes, make sure that you scale the intensity of the sound so that you can still impress the player with something bigger at the end. Okay, so this is those are the sounds that I used for the lion, and I started off with quite noisy, growly sound for the lion, and it sounds cool. But I felt that it could be a little bit more tonal, so I layered in a couple of more samples. And then, like I said, there is a background to it. It's still quite tonal, and it's still quite low in the mix. So we have that breathing space I was mentioning earlier. So there's a few magic layers going on at the same time. And again, all pass phase, de-reverb to keep it uncluttered, and voice denoise to again, keep it cluttered. Not much else happening there. And then once we have the charge up, we will move on to the actual blast. And there are a couple of different layers in there. We'll start off with the actual explosion. And I wanted the explosion again to be quite tonal and have a lot of character. This is the explosion sound. So there's a lot of like hissing elements there. In hindsight, maybe a little bit too much, but you know, it is what it is. But it still has a lot of tonality and a lot of character. And there are a couple of different things I did here in game audio, because you never know how many other things are going to be happening at the same time. I usually try to keep the extreme low end and to a very small section of the sound, and because of that, I'm usually cutting and processing the transient separately from the tail and the body. And because of that, I can apply a more aggressive processing to the transient. So this is the transient that we have here. And it's quite distorted. There's some transient shaping here, saturation, and low end there is adding that extreme low end of the spectrum. And I find with those kinds of sounds, it's okay to distort stuff for a split second, because it can add some grittiness and character to the sound. And then the rest of the sound is not processed so aggressively. The thing I'm usually doing with tail to again leave a lot of breathing room for other sounds is I'm cutting the low end at around 100 hertz, but it's not a set rule. And the tail, and it's kind of a tail and the body. I'm using those layers to create the kind of the character of the sound. So there's a impactful transient, and then we shape the character of the sound with the tail and body. And this is how the tail sounds. And then there is an interesting chain that we have here on the main bus of the explosion. Sound designer Zvi Sherman shared this chain quite recently, and I recommend watching that video. But just briefly, I'll just go through some bits that I used here. So there's denoise to declutter the sound. Then we use a compressor with a very specific attack value to enhance the transient even further. Then we have some clipping with Oxford inflator, and this is parametrized, which means that it responds to the input signal. Then we have the reverb as well to declutter it, filter freak to add some movement, all pass phase to add tonality, and a little bit more saturation in here. So without it, it sounds like this. And with it, there will be a little bit less noise elements, there will be a little bit more tonal elements. And it's a little bit grittier, in my opinion. And then we have a couple of different layers that we will use for kind of like those character layers, even to add this even more. There's some magic sounds that represent the fire. And without processing, they sound like this. And you might think that this is a decent explosion on its own, and I would agree. The thing is, again, we should really think about this in terms of listening to it in context. Without any sidechain processing, it sounds good, but again, I think we wouldn't leave enough space for the actual explosion. So again, I'm using the track spacer. I'm taking the signal from the transient and applying both track spacer and compressor, and taking the full, excuse me, bus of the explosion and applying a little bit more track spacer to leave even more space. And as you can see, I can determine what's the extent, to what extent of the frequency spectrum track spacer is actually working. And with it, it sounds like this. Which again, doesn't sound that fantastic in isolation, but it does leave more space for the explosion. Which I think is a nice addition. Then we have a sub layer. I like to process it separately and add a lot of low-end saturation. This is mainly because I feel that our duty is to be able to provide for as many players as possible to be able to enjoy what you're doing essentially, and a lot of low-end speakers are not able to reproduce the low end of the spectrum. You can try to remedy that by distorting saturating your bass frequencies, which means that there will be more higher end harmonics, and it will create a feeling of more bass tones, even though they don't really exist there. So there's some of that here. And I'm purposefully not using the transient of that, because there's a lot of transient going on here. There's a bit of a sweetener of just the attack of a boom library explosion. And we combine that with the previous elements as well. We will listen to all of them in a second. But also to add a little bit more character, there's just some run-of-the-mill explosion tails. And I don't think I did it here, but usually if I work with this, I do tend to cut the low end as well to declutter it. Here I didn't do it. I must have had a reason. And I also felt that we could use the tail to add a little bit more character into it. So I took some lion sounds, and I stretch them and use them as a tail layer. And all together, it sounds like this. Which I think sounded pretty neat. One last thing that I felt that helped the sound is to kind of ground it with a little bit of VO and Foley. Without the VO and Foley, there seemed to be something lacking in the sound. It didn't feel like that character was performing those actions, so there's not that much going on here. I did add a little bit of like armor Foley here. And then a couple of VO barks in there. What I found quite interesting is that when I was doing this, and listening to the vocals in isolation, it always felt a little bit off, like they're too late or something. But again, I can't stress enough how important it is to listen to stuff in context. So if I left the VO when I felt the VO should be when I was isolating it, it would be clashing with other elements of the sound. So it's very important to think of the global picture of what else is going to be happening at the same time. So there you go. This is how I approached it. I think it went pretty well. If you have any questions, would like me to go over anything else that I did here, please feel free to ask. And if you enjoy this content, you can consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, because if there's any demand for it, I can do more of this stuff. Thank you very much.